Detective Miles Harding considered himself a connoisseur of conclusions. He savored the final satisfying click of a case file shutting, the neat bow of a signed confession, the clean, straight line from crime to conviction. This case, the brutal robbery and murder of a wealthy socialite, had been a jagged mess of loose ends and political pressure. But now it was a masterpiece of efficiency. He had his killer, a twitchy lowlife named Ricky Finn, who had crumbled under 12 hours of sustained, methodical questioning. The confession was signed. The murder weapon, a common kitchen knife, was recovered from a dumpster behind Finn's apartment. It was perfect. It was closed. The only discordant note in his symphony of justice was the silent, staring man in the corner of the observation room, a human piece of static he could not tune out. The man's name, according to the intake form, was Silas. Just Silas. No last name, no address, no history. He had been found at the scene, huddled in an ornate alcove in the victim's sprawling mansion, covered in dust but otherwise untouched. He was nonverbal, a diagnosis made hastily by a paramedic and cemented by his unnerving, unbroken silence ever since. He wore simple, worn clothes, a gray Henley and dark trousers that seemed a size too large, making him look like a scarecrow loosely stuffed. He sat on a hard plastic chair, his hands resting in his lap, his posture unnaturally still. But his eyes, a pale and startling blue, were a maelstrom of activity. They darted and scanned, absorbing every detail of the room, every flicker of the fluorescent lights, every subtle shift in Harding's weight. They were the eyes of a witness. Harding hated those eyes. They were an accusation. They were an unresolved variable in an equation he had already solved. He stood in the observation room, separated from the main bullpen by a pane of one-way glass, and watched his team buzzing with the energy of a solved homicide. Laughter echoed off the cinder-block walls, mingling with the acrid smell of stale coffee and the hum of overworked computer servers. It was the smell of victory. But Harding's gaze kept snapping back to the reflection of the interrogation room behind him, to the silent man who was an anchor dragging on his triumph. He pushed open the door, the metal groaning in protest. The air inside was colder, more sterile. It smelled of bleach and fear. Silas did not flinch. His eyes simply shifted, locking onto Harding with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. The detective's own reflection warped in the polished surface of the steel table, his expensive, tailored suit and confident posture looking suddenly clownish, a caricature of authority. He saw the condescending smile he had practiced in the mirror and felt it curdle on his lips. "All right, let's get this over with." Harding's voice was a boom, designed to fill spaces and crush dissent. It was a tool he wielded with the same blunt force as a battering ram. "Patrol's gonna take you down to the county shelter. They'll get you a hot meal, a bed, then you're their problem." He spoke not to Silas, but past him, as if addressing an invisible handler. He made a show of looking at his watch, a gaudy gold thing that was his personal trophy for closing the Riverbend Strangler case 3 years prior. Time, his gesture implied, was a currency Silas could not afford to waste. Silas did not move. He did not blink. His gaze remained fixed, a laser of silent inquiry. His stillness was not passive. It was a wall. It was a form of defiance so profound it felt like a shout in the crushing silence. Harding felt a familiar spark of irritation flare in his chest. He hated being ignored. He was a man who commanded rooms, who made suspects weep and hardened criminals confess. To be met with this placid, unyielding void was an insult to the very architecture of his ego. "Did you hear me?" Harding leaned forward, planting his manicured hands on the table. The gold watch glinted under the harsh overhead light. "Time to go. Vamoose, end of the line." He used simple words, speaking slowly, as if to a child or a dog. Each word was a little pat of condescension. Slowly, deliberately, Silas raised one hand. His finger, long and slender, extended and pointed directly at Harding's chest. Then his hand swiveled, the finger now pointing toward the one-way mirror, toward the bullpen where the celebration was in full swing. Finally, he brought his hand back and shook his head. A single, sharp, negative motion. The sequence was clear. You. Them. Wrong. A flicker of something cold and sharp pricked at Harding's composure. It was the ghost of a doubt. He crushed it instantly. This was a vagrant, a nobody, a man whose mind was likely a scrambled mess of broken signals. Ricky Finn had confessed. That was ground truth. That was the bedrock on which his case was built. This was just noise. Cute, a little pantomime. Harding sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You're no Marcel Marceau, pal. We've got a signed confession. We've got the weapon. It's over. He straightened up, smoothing the lapels of his jacket. The action was meant to reassert his dominance, to physically smooth away the wrinkle of doubt Silas had placed in his perfect narrative. But Silas was not finished. He began to tap on the table. A rhythm, not random, but structured. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap. His eyes never left Harding's, and they seemed to be urging him, pleading with him to understand a language beyond words. He was trying to communicate something specific, something urgent. The sound was maddening, like a leaky faucet in a house of cards. Each tap was a tiny tremor threatening the detective's carefully constructed reality. It was then that a young patrol officer, David Miller, appeared at the doorway. He was barely out of the academy, his uniform still crisp, his face still holding the earnest, wide-eyed look of someone who believed in the ideals of the job, not just the mechanics of it. Sir, transports here for the witness. Miller's voice was hesitant. He glanced from his imposing superior to the silent man at the table, a flicker of unease in his eyes. Good, get him out of my sight, Harding barked, turning his back on Silas completely. It was a dismissal of the highest order. He was erasing the man from his reality. I'm putting a bow on this for the chief. I don't want any more distractions. As Miller stepped into the room, Silas's tapping grew more frantic. His knuckles were white. His other hand clenched and unclenched at his side. He looked at Miller, his eyes wide with a desperate, frantic plea. He pointed again, this time at a stack of blank paperwork on the corner of the table, then mimed the act of writing, his hand moving through the air in graceful, controlled strokes. A pen. He needed a pen. Miller paused. He was a creature of protocol, of following orders. Harding was his superior, a decorated detective who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. But the intensity in Silas's gaze was something he had never encountered. It wasn't madness. It was a terrifying, lucid clarity. It was the look of a man trapped behind a wall of glass, screaming without a sound. What is it now? Harding spun around, his face a mask of thunderous fury. His patience had not just run out, it had been incinerated. He saw Silas's miming, saw the hope blooming in Miller's hesitant expression, and something inside him snapped. The audacity of it. The sheer, galling impertinence of this nobody, this ghost, demanding a voice. He wants to write something, I think, sir, Miller said, his own voice barely a whisper. Harding let out a short, barking laugh that was utterly devoid of humor. It was a sound like grinding metal. He strode over to the stack of paper, snatched a single sheet, and deliberately, theatrically, crumpled it into a tight ball. He tossed the wadded paper onto the table in front of Silas, where it landed with a soft, pathetic thud. What's he going to do, Miller? Draw me a pretty picture? The words were a lash, coated in venomous mockery. The sarcasm was thick enough to choke on. Is he going to sketch out the killer's feelings for us? Give us an artistic interpretation of the crime? He leaned in close to Silas, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. You saw nothing. You know nothing. You are nothing. You are a loose end, and I am tying you off. The room fell into a silence that was heavier than any sound. The air crackled with the force of Harding's cruelty. Miller stood frozen. his hand hovering near the doorframe, a knot of shame and anger tightening in his gut. He saw the crumpled ball of paper on the table. He saw the hope in Silas's eyes extinguish, replaced by a deep, hollow sorrow. But beneath the sorrow, something else remained. A core of resolve. A stillness that was not broken, but tempered. Harding, satisfied that he had crushed this final, irritating flicker of defiance, turned and swept out of the room. "Get him out of here," he threw over his shoulder, the words a final hammer blow. "Now!" Miller watched him go, the detective's broad shoulders filling the doorway before disappearing into the triumphant noise of the bullpen. He was left alone with Silas and the echo of that taunt. "Draw me a pretty picture." The words hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Miller looked at Silas, truly looked at him, and saw the intelligence burning behind the silence. He saw a man who held a truth that no one was willing to see. And in that moment, a quiet, dangerous decision began to form in the young officer's heart. The injustice was a physical thing, a sour taste in his mouth, a weight on his soul. He could not let it stand. Timestamp 001500. Harding's command was an iron barrier. "Take him to Central Holding. I want him processed for a 72-hour psych hold. He's a danger to himself, obviously, wandering into a murder scene." The detective's voice, broadcast over the precinct's internal comms, was smooth and authoritative, each word a brick in the wall he was building around his perfect case. He was not just removing Silas, he was discrediting him, branding him as mentally unfit, ensuring that if he ever did find a way to communicate, no one would believe him. It was a masterstroke of bureaucratic violence. Officer Miller was tasked with the transport. He cuffed Silas's hands in front of him, the cold steel clicking shut with a sound of finality. The protocol was clear, the orders were direct, but Miller's hands trembled slightly. He felt like a traitor. Silas offered no resistance. He stood with a quiet dignity that seemed to mock the restraints, his gaze distant, as if he were already looking past the grimy walls of the precinct and into a place no one else could see. As Miller led him through the bullpen, a few officers glanced up, their faces a mixture of pity and disinterest. To them, Silas was just another piece of human debris being swept away. Harding watched them from his glass-walled office, a smug monarch surveying his domain. He was on the phone with the deputy chief, his voice a low, confident purr, recounting the triumph of the interrogation, the neatness of the confession. He didn't give Silas a second glance. The problem was solved. The distraction was being removed. In the sterile, echoing hallway leading to the basement holding cells, Miller felt the weight of Silas's silence more acutely than ever. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and regret. Miller's mind kept replaying Harding's mocking words. "Draw me a pretty picture." An idea, reckless and insubordinate, began to take root in his mind. He remembered seeing Silas's intake property log. Among the pathetic collection of items, a half-eaten protein bar, a worn leather wallet with no ID, a single key, was an item logged as miscellaneous art supplies. A small canvas roll-up case. The processing officer had scoffed at it. "Contraband," he'd grunted, tossing it into a locker. As they descended the concrete steps to the holding area, Miller made a decision. It was a career-ending, court-martial-worthy decision, but it felt like the only moral choice he had left. The holding sergeant, a grizzled veteran named O'Malley with a face like a roadmap of cynicism, barely looked up from his crossword puzzle. "One for the tank," Miller said, his voice tight. "Name?" O'Malley grunted, not lifting his eyes. "John Doe. Psych hold paperwork is coming down from Harding." O'Malley gestured with his pen towards a bleak, empty cell. "Put him in 6. Try not to get any on you." Miller unlocked the cell door, its screech echoing in the tomb-like silence of the basement. He led Silas inside. The cell was a concrete box containing only a steel slab for a bed and a toilet. The air was frigid. Miller removed the handcuffs, his fingers brushing against Silas's cool skin. For a moment, their eyes met. In Silas's pale blue gaze, Miller saw not gratitude, but a profound and weary understanding. It was as if Silas knew the risk the young officer was taking, and the weight of that knowledge was a burden in itself. Miller started, but the words died in his throat. What could he say? I'm sorry my boss is a monster? I believe you? Instead, he acted. With his back to the security camera, a camera he knew O'Malley wasn't watching, he slipped his hand into his own pocket. He pulled out a small police-issue notepad and a cheap ballpoint pen he'd taken from the supply closet. He pressed them into Silas's hand. I don't know what you saw, Miller whispered, his voice hoarse, but if you can, show them. He didn't wait for a reaction. He backed out of the cell, slammed the heavy door shut, and locked it. The sound was a thunderclap of finality. He walked back to O'Malley's desk, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had just handed a potential criminal a weapon, given a witness unmonitored communication tools. He had broken a dozen regulations. Back in the cell, Silas stood motionless for a long moment, the notepad and pen feeling alien and heavy in his hand. The dim, yellow light from the hallway cast long shadows across the concrete floor. He looked at the objects, then at his own trembling fingers. The pen felt like a key, a spark. He sank onto the edge of the steel slab, the cold seeping through his thin trousers. He closed his eyes. The world outside the cell dissolved. The smell of bleach and despair faded, replaced by the scent of ozone and rain-soaked earth. The cold concrete under him became the rough bark of an old oak tree. He was no longer in a holding cell. He was 7 years old again, hiding in the hollow of that tree, his small body racked with silent sobs. He could hear the shouts of his father, angry and drunk, echoing through the woods. He could see the glint of the setting sun on the broken bottle his father wielded. He was hiding, trying to make himself so small, so quiet, that the world would forget he existed. But then he saw it. Through a knot in the tree's trunk, he saw his mother step between his father and the house. He saw her stand, small and defiant, her arms outstretched. He saw the flash of movement, the arc of the bottle, the sickening thud. He saw her fall. He saw the red blossoming on her simple cotton dress, a terrible, vibrant flower against the pale fabric. He had tried to scream, but the sound had been strangled in his throat, a knot of horror so absolute it had severed the connection between his mind and his voice. The sound had never come. It had been trapped inside him, a silent, reverberating shockwave that had reshaped his entire world. He had been found the next morning, curled in the hollow of the tree, mute and catatonic. His father had crafted a story of a tragic fall, a story the small-town police were all too willing to believe. Silas was the only witness, and he was a broken one. In the sterile environment of the children's home that followed, a kind art therapist had given him a box of charcoal pencils. He had resisted at first, but then, one night, the images in his head became too much to bear. The memory was not a ghost, it was a living entity, replaying itself with perfect, torturous clarity. He took a pencil, and on a sheet of butcher paper, he let it out. It wasn't a child's drawing. It was a work of shocking, brutal photorealism. He drew the scene not as he had felt it, but as he had seen it. The precise pattern of the bark on the tree, the way the light caught a single bead of sweat on his father's temple, the brand name on the label of the broken bottle, the exact, horrifying pattern of the bloodstain on his mother's dress. The doctors were baffled. They called it post-traumatic savant syndrome, a neurological lightning strike. The trauma had destroyed his ability to speak, but it had unlocked something else, a perfect, eidetic memory, fused with an innate, impossible artistic talent. His memory was a camera, his hand a printer. His art was not an interpretation, it was testimony. Silas opened his eyes. The concrete walls of the cell returned. The memory, sharp and painful as ever, receded, leaving behind its familiar residue of grief and resolve. He looked at the pen in his hand. He had spent his life running from that ability, drawing only landscapes and abstract shapes, trying to keep the horrors locked away. He had drifted from town to town, a ghost, his silence a shield. But now another injustice had found him. Another truth was being buried. Harding's sneering face superimposed itself over the memory of his father's. The arrogance, the dismissal, the absolute certainty of a man building a world on a foundation of lies. He would not be a silent witness again. He tore a sheet from the notepad. The paper was flimsy, the pen cheap. It was not his familiar charcoal, not the high-quality paper he used when he could afford it. It was a crude tool for crude necessity. He placed the paper on the cold steel bed, knelt on the floor, and brought the tip of the pen to the page. He closed his eyes for a second, summoning the scene from the mansion. It appeared in his mind, not as a memory, but as a fully rendered, three-dimensional space he could move through. He saw it all: the glint of the chandelier on the polished marble floor, the overturned vase of lilies, the victim on the floor, her life bleeding out onto an expensive Persian rug. And he saw the killer, not Ricky Finn, the twitchy, terrified man he had seen in the interrogation room. No, the killer was someone else entirely, someone taller, colder, more precise. His hand began to move. The cheap pen scratched against the paper, the sound loud in the oppressive silence. It was not the fluid grace of his charcoal, but a series of sharp, decisive strokes. He was not drawing a picture. He was transcribing a fact. He was giving a statement, and with every line, every shadow, every meticulously rendered detail, he was forging the weapon that would bring Detective Harding's perfect world crashing down around him. Timestamp 0.30. While Silas worked in the frozen silence of his cell, Officer Miller was fighting a war in the quiet corridors of his own conscience. He had returned to the bullpen, his face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. He sat at his shared desk, pretending to fill out a mundane equipment requisition form, but the words blurred into meaningless squiggles. Every tick of the clock on the wall was a countdown to his own professional demise. He had directly disobeyed a superior officer and tampered with a witness in custody. The consequences were not abstract. They were specific and brutal. He would be fired, disgraced. He might even face criminal charges. He risked a glance toward Harding's office. The detective was still on the phone, but his posture had changed. He was leaning back in his expensive leather chair, one hand behind his head, laughing. It was the relaxed, easy laugh of a man who had won. The sound grated on Miller's nerves like nails on a chalkboard. That laughter was built on a lie Miller himself was now complicit in covering up, even as he tried to dismantle it. The irony was a bitter pill. He had acted to reveal the truth, yet his actions had forced him deeper into deception. His gaze drifted to the evidence locker log on his computer screen. He scanned the property list for Silas again. Miscellaneous art supplies. Canvas roll-up. The description was so dismissive, so incurious. It was that casual disregard for detail that had allowed Harding to build his flimsy case. The detective had seen a confession and stopped looking. He had seen a nonverbal man and stopped listening. Miller, however, was a rookie. He was still in the habit of looking at everything because he didn't yet know what was important and what wasn't. He remembered something from the crime scene, a detail that had bothered him at the time but that he'd dismissed as irrelevant. He had been one of the first officers on the scene, tasked with securing the perimeter. While waiting for the forensics team, he had done a slow walk of the room. High on one of the ornate vaulted ceilings, almost lost in the shadows, was a small, state-of-the-art security camera, no bigger than a golf ball. It had a tiny, blinking red light. He'd mentioned it to the first detective on site, who had grunted and said, Yeah, we'll get to it." But later, the official report from Harding's team stated that the home security system had been disabled. The DVR stolen. Case closed on that front. But Miller remembered the blinking light. A blinking light meant it was recording, likely to an off-site cloud server. Had anyone actually checked? Or had they simply accepted the missing DVR as the end of the story? This small, nagging detail, combined with the searing certainty in Silas's eyes, coalesced into a single, terrifying thought. Harding didn't just make a mistake. He was willfully blind. Or worse. The twitchy confessor, Ricky Finn, was a known informant for one of Harding's rivals in the department. Pinning a high-profile murder on him was a convenient way for Harding to score points and embarrass another detective. It was a clean, simple narrative that served his career. The truth was messy. The truth might lead to a dead end, or worse, to a powerful, well-connected killer who would be much harder to convict. Harding hadn't sought justice. He'd sought a story that he could sell. The weight of this realization settled on Miller like a shroud. This was bigger than just one case. It was about a rot at the core of the system he had sworn to uphold. His small act of defiance, giving Silas a pen, now felt hopelessly inadequate. What good was a drawing if it was just going to be locked away in an evidence bag, dismissed as the ramblings of a madman? He needed more. He needed someone with enough power to force Harding to listen. His mind raced. Who could he go to? The chief? He had no proof, only a rookie's intuition and a story about a silent man. They would laugh him out of the office and hand him his walking papers. Internal affairs? That would trigger a long, drawn-out investigation, giving Harding ample time to cover his tracks and destroy Miller's career in the process. He felt trapped, a tiny cog in a machine that was grinding towards a terrible injustice. Then he remembered something else. While logging Silas's property, he had noticed a small, laminated card tucked into a hidden fold of the worn leather wallet. Unlike the rest of the wallet, the card was clean, almost new. It had a name and a number printed on it in stark black letters. Dr. Aris Thorne, followed by a phone number with a New York area code. Underneath the number, a single, stark instruction. In case of emergency, contact immediately. Do not delay. At the time, Miller had assumed it was for a generic physician. But the name? Thorne. It tickled a memory from one of his college psychology courses. With trembling fingers, Miller opened a browser window on his computer, hiding it behind the requisition form. He typed the name Aris Thorne into the search bar. The results flooded the screen, and Miller's breath caught in his chest. Dr. Aris Thorne was not just a physician. He was the world's foremost authority on acquired savant syndrome and eidetic memory. He was the head of the Thorne Institute for Neurocognitive Studies, a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient, and the author of the seminal text on the subject, The Unspoken Truth. The book's cover filled the screen, and Miller had to stifle a gasp. His psych professor had called Thorne a legend, a man who had revolutionized the understanding of the human brain's response to trauma. This was it. This was the key. Silas wasn't just some random drifter. He was known. He was studied. He was under the care of one of the most brilliant minds on the planet. The card wasn't a suggestion. It was a protocol, an emergency protocol. Miller's heart hammered. A new kind of fear, sharper and more exhilarating than the fear for his career, seized him. This was his one shot. He looked at the clock. Silas had been in the holding cell for nearly an hour. The transport to the county psychiatric facility was probably already being arranged. He had to act now. He stood up, his legs feeling unsteady. He walked stiffly towards the break room, trying to look casual. The room was empty, smelling of burnt popcorn and sour milk. He pulled out his personal cell phone. Dialing the number from memory, his thumb hovered over the call button. This was the point of no return. He was about to go over the head of a decorated detective, contact a civilian, and blow a major homicide investigation wide open based on a gut feeling. He pressed the button. The phone rang twice, then a crisp, articulate voice answered, devoid of any preamble. Thorne. Miller's throat went dry. Yes, Dr. Thorne? My name is Officer David Miller with the City Police Department. He cringed at how reedy and unprofessional he sounded. Do you have him? Thorne's voice was sharp, instantly alert. There was no confusion, no questioning of who he was. Yes, sir, Miller stammered. He's in custody. A man named Silas. He was found at a crime scene. A heavy sigh came through the phone, a sound of profound weariness and frustration. Is he harmed? No, sir, he's physically fine, but they're not listening to him. The detective in charge, he thinks Silas is mentally incompetent. They're about to transfer him to a psychiatric facility. Absolutely not. The command was instantaneous, backed by an authority that seemed to radiate through the phone. You will not allow them to move him. Do you understand me, Officer Miller? His mind is a fortress, but it is also a delicate ecosystem. A place like that could do irreparable damage. I don't have the authority to stop it, sir, Miller confessed, shame burning in his cheeks. Then you will create the authority, Thorne said, his voice a blade of ice. Listen to me very carefully. Silas Blackwood is not incompetent. He is a mnemonic savant of the highest order. His visual recall is not just photographic, it is absolute. He does not remember a scene. He inhabits it. What he sees is the objective, unvarnished truth. If he is trying to tell you something about that crime scene, it is not a theory. It is a fact. Has he been given a means to communicate? Paper? A drawing instrument? I gave him a notepad and a pen, sir, Miller admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Thorne spoke again, his voice had a new note of respect. Then you have done more for justice today than your superiors could possibly comprehend. Now, buy me time. Whatever it takes, stall the transport, lose the paperwork, I'm on my way. And I am bringing people who possess an authority your detective cannot ignore. The line went dead. Miller stood in the break room, his phone clutched in a white-knuckled grip. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with a surge of adrenaline, a terrifying, thrilling sense of purpose. He had thrown a match into a powder keg. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew that the quiet, orderly precinct was about to become the epicenter of a storm. And at its heart was a silent man in a concrete box drawing the truth. Timestamp 004500. The call galvanized Dr. Eris Thorne into immediate, decisive action. He was a man who operated on a plane of intellectual rigor and absolute certainty, and the news of Silas Blackwood's predicament was an intolerable breach of the order he sought to protect. Silas was not just a patient to him. He was a living testament to the profound mysteries of the human mind, a rare and precious soul whom Thorne had sworn to shield from the blunt incomprehension of the world. From his office on the top floor of the Thorne Institute, a sanctuary of quiet thought and gleaming chrome overlooking Central Park, Thorne initiated a cascade of communications. His first call was not to a lawyer or a civil rights advocate. It was to a number on a private, encrypted line. The voice that answered was female, crisp, and radiated an aura of no-nonsense command. "Rostova." "Eva, it's Eris," Thorne said, his voice tight with urgency. "I have a situation. It requires your immediate and theatrical intervention." Captain Eva Rostova was the head of the city's Internal Affairs Bureau, a woman known throughout the department as the Iron Captain. She was a legend, a figure of unimpeachable integrity and merciless efficiency who had dismantled corrupt units and ended the careers of powerful men with a quiet, surgical precision. She and Thorne had a history, born from a complex case years ago where his expertise had exonerated one of her best officers. They shared a mutual respect and an intolerance for incompetence. "Where and when, Eris?" she asked, no further questions needed. "Precinct 17. "Now," Thorne replied. "One of your detectives, a man named Harding, has taken a protected asset of my institute into custody. He is about to commit a catastrophic miscarriage of justice." He quickly, concisely explained the situation. Silas Blackwood, his unique condition, and Detective Harding's arrogant dismissal. He relayed Officer Miller's desperate call and the detail about the drawing. "Harding," Rostova repeated the name, and the single word was laced with a cold disdain. "Miles Harding, the Golden Boy. He's ambitious, sloppy, and values headlines over casework. This has his fingerprints all over it." She paused for a beat. "I'm 5 minutes away. I'll meet you there. Don't enter the building without me. We'll make this a formal visit." The line cut. Thorne knew what a formal visit from Captain Rostova entailed. It was not a quiet chat. It was a full-scale institutional reckoning. He grabbed his coat and a thick leather portfolio from his desk. Inside the portfolio were peer-reviewed articles, brain scans, and video documentation of Silas's abilities, an arsenal of irrefutable scientific proof. As he strode through the quiet halls of his institute, his assistants and researchers watched him pass, sensing the storm brewing behind his grim expression. He was no longer a scientist. He was a warrior mobilizing for battle. Meanwhile, at Precinct 17, Detective Harding was at the apex of his triumph. He had just concluded a preliminary, off-the-record briefing with a hand-picked journalist from the city's largest newspaper, feeding him a heroic narrative of brilliant detective work and a swift, satisfying conclusion. He was leaning against the edge of his desk, bathed in the adulation of his squad, when the main doors of the bullpen flew open with a percussive bang that silenced the entire floor. Every head turned. The laughter died. The celebratory hum of the office ceased as if a switch had been thrown. Framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon light, stood Captain Eva Rostova. She was flanked by two grim-faced IA lieutenants in severe black suits, their presence alone enough to send a chill through the room. Rostova herself was immaculate in her full-dress uniform, the stars on her collar glinting like chips of ice. Her expression was one of absolute, unassailable authority. Behind her, a step to the right, was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and piercing eyes, clutching a leather portfolio to his chest like a weapon. Dr. Eris Thorne had arrived. The air in the room became thick and heavy. Officers who had been lounging at their desks slowly, almost unconsciously, straightened their backs. The journalist Harding had been courting took a half-step back, his reporter's instincts screaming that the story had just changed dramatically. Harding's smug smile froze, then melted from his face, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief, which quickly curdled into defensive anger. The arrival of the IA captain, unannounced, was the equivalent of a public executioner walking into a king's feast. It was a violation of the natural order. Rostova's gaze swept the room, cold and appraising. It was a look that could strip paint. She completely ignored the dumbstruck Harding, her eyes scanning the faces of the uniformed officers, searching. Her gaze landed on Officer Miller, who was standing by his desk, pale and rigid as a statue. She had read his file in the car on the way over. Valedictorian of his academy class, impeccable record, a single minor demerit for insubordination during a training exercise where he had questioned a flawed tactical scenario. A thinker, a dissenter. She strode towards him, her footsteps the only sound in the cavernous room. The two lieutenants fanned out, securing the space, their movements economical and vaguely predatory. Dr. Thorne followed in Rostova's wake, his eyes also fixed on Miller. "Officer Miller." Rostova's voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the clarity of a bell. "Yes, Captain," Miller managed to say, his own voice sounding small and fragile. "You made a phone call approximately 37 minutes ago," she stated, not asked. This was it. The moment of reckoning. Miller swallowed hard. "Yes, Captain, I did." Harding finally found his voice. He pushed himself off his desk and took a swaggering step forward, trying to reclaim control of the scene. "Captain Rostova, What is the meaning of this? This is my crime scene, my investigation, and this officer is about to be formally reprimanded for a serious breach of protocol." Rostova did not even turn to look at him. She kept her eyes locked on Miller. It was a dismissal so complete, so absolute, that it was more insulting than any rebuke. It was as if Harding were a piece of furniture, a buzzing fly she couldn't be bothered to swat. The public humiliation was staggering. Harding's face flushed a deep, mottled red. "Where is he?" Rostova asked Miller, her voice softening by a fraction of a degree. "Central holding, ma'am. Cell 6, Miller replied. "Take us there," she commanded. She then glanced at one of her lieutenants. "Lieutenant, secure Detective Harding's office, his computer, his files, everything. He's not to make any calls or speak with anyone." The lieutenant nodded and moved towards Harding's glass-walled office with an implacable calm. Harding sputtered, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and panic. "On what grounds? You can't just come in here and—" "I can," Rostova said, finally turning to face him. Her voice was pure ice. "And I am. You are being investigated for gross dereliction of duty, evidence tampering, and the coercion of a false confession. Now, you will either stand down, or my officers will help you stand down." The threat hung in the air, vibrating with unspoken violence. Harding looked from Rostova's granite-hard face to the impassive expressions of her lieutenants. He saw the end of his career opening up like a chasm at his feet. His bravado evaporated, leaving behind a pasty, sweating fear. He shrank back, rendered speechless, his authority dissolving into nothing before the eyes of his entire squad. Rostova turned her back on him again and nodded to Miller. "Lead the way, officer." As Miller led the captain and the doctor towards the basement stairs, the bullpen remained in a state of suspended animation. The officers watched them go, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and, for a few, a grim sense of satisfaction. The air crackled with the fall of a king. The entire power structure of the precinct had been dismantled in less than 2 minutes. The theatrical intervention Thorne had requested was underway, and the main act was about to begin. Timestamp. The descent into the basement was a journey into another world. The manufactured energy of the bullpen gave way to a cold, damp silence, broken only by the rhythmic click of Captain Rostova's heels on the concrete steps. Officer Miller's heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He fumbled with the keys at Sergeant O'Malley's desk, the grizzled sergeant now bolt upright, his crossword forgotten, his eyes wide with a fear Miller had never seen in the old man before. "Captain," O'Malley stammered, scrambling to his feet. Rostova gave him a look that could freeze water. "Open the cell." Miller unlocked the door to cell 6 and pulled it open. The scene inside was startling. Silas was not huddled in a corner or lying on the slab. He was on his knees on the floor, the flimsy notepad spread before him under the dim hallway light. He was utterly absorbed, his entire being focused on the point where the cheap pen met the paper. His hand moved with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing, a blur of controlled motion. He did not seem to have noticed their arrival. Dr. Thorne stepped forward, his voice soft, gentle, so as not to break the spell. "Silas." Silas's hand stilled. He looked up, his pale eyes blinking slowly, as if emerging from a great depth. He saw Dr. Thorne, and a flicker of something, relief, recognition, exhaustion, passed across his features. Then his gaze shifted to Captain Rostova in her immaculate uniform, and finally to Officer Miller, who stood half-hidden behind them. He gave Miller a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a confirmation. "Thank you." Thorne knelt beside him, his movements careful, respectful. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the notepad. Silas pushed the pad across the dusty concrete floor. He had filled 4 pages. Thorne picked them up, his expression one of intense concentration. He studied the first page, then the second. His breath hitched. He turned and handed the pages to Captain Rostova. Rostova took the small sheets of paper. She had been expecting a crude sketch, a clue, something that would require interpretation. She was not prepared for what she saw. It was not a drawing. It was a deposition. The first page was a rendering of the crime scene that was more detailed than any photograph. The perspective was impossible. A wide-angle view from a high corner of the room, precisely where Miller had seen the security camera. It captured everything. The victim's position, the spray of blood on the wall rendered in a cross-hatching so fine it looked like a grayscale photo, the overturned furniture. But it was the subsequent pages that were damning. Silas had drawn a face. A man's face, seen from 3 distinct angles. One was a direct portrait, cold, arrogant, with a small crescent-shaped scar above his left eyebrow. The second was the man's hand, showing a unique, intricate tattoo of a coiled serpent on his wrist. The third, and most breathtaking, was a close-up of a shard of a broken mirror on the floor. Reflected in the tiny piece of glass, distorted but perfectly clear, was the killer's face again, and beside it the reflection of a specific, rare model of a tactical flashlight, its brand name, and a partial serial number clearly legible on the casing. Rostova felt a cold knot of certainty form in her stomach. This was not the face of Ricky Finn. This was irrefutable, physical evidence, created from a place no one could have accessed. "This is impossible," she whispered, not with doubt, but with awe. "No, Captain," Dr. Thorne said, his voice resonating in the quiet basement. "It is simply inevitable. This is what he does. This is who he is." He helped Silas to his feet, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Let's go upstairs. I believe Detective Harding is owed a demonstration." They ascended back into the bullpen. The atmosphere was still thick with tension. Every officer was frozen in place, watching the doorway to the basement. Harding stood by his office, flanked by the 2 IA lieutenants, his face a pale, sweating mask of fury and fear. He looked like a cornered animal. Rostova strode to the center of the room, the 4 small sheets of paper held in her hand. Thorne guided Silas to a chair, shielding him slightly with his own body. Miller stood a few paces away, a silent sentinel. "Detective Harding," Rostova's voice boomed, and Harding flinched as if struck. "You based your entire case on a coerced confession from a man named Ricky Finn. You declared the case closed." "The confession is solid," Harding spat, trying to muster some of his old bravado. He knew details only the killer could know. "Details you fed him during 12 hours of unrecorded interrogation," Rostova countered, her voice dropping to a lethal calm. She held up the first drawing. "Our witness, Mr. Silas Blackwood, who you dismissed as a vegetable, has provided a statement. He has drawn the crime scene from the perspective of a security camera that your report claimed was inoperable." A murmur went through the room. Several officers who had been at the scene exchanged uneasy glances. They remembered the camera. They remembered it being dismissed. "That's a fantasy." Harding's voice was getting shrill. "He's a mental patient. He drew a picture, so what? It proves nothing." "On the contrary," Dr. Thorne stepped forward, his academic tone a stark contrast to Rostova's iron command. "It proves everything. Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the entire room, "what you are looking at is not art in the conventional sense. Mr. Blackwood possesses a condition known as post-traumatic mnemonic savantism. His brain does not process memory as you or I do. It records sensory data with perfect eidetic fidelity. He does not recall a scene. He re-experiences it. These drawings are not interpretations. They are literal, objective data dumps from his visual cortex onto paper. They are more reliable than a photograph because a camera can be fooled. His memory cannot." Thorne's words, delivered with the unshakable confidence of a world-renowned expert, landed with the force of a physical blow. The concept was so far beyond their experience it was almost science fiction, but the authority with which he spoke made it terrifyingly real. Rostova held up the second drawing, the portrait of the killer. This is the man Mr. Blackwood saw commit the murder. She then held up the third, the drawing of the hand. This is his tattoo. She let the images sink in. The face was cold, professional, a world away from the desperate, twitchy Ricky Finn. Harding laughed, a high, unhinged sound. A drawing! You're going to throw away a signed confession for a drawing? This is a circus. No, Detective, Rostova said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was more menacing than any shout. This is a courtroom, and this is Exhibit A. She held up the final damning drawing, the reflection in the shard of glass. Mr. Blackwood has rendered a partial serial number from the killer's flashlight, reflected in a mirror fragment, a fragment your forensics team logged but dismissed as unimportant. She turned to one of her lieutenants. Run this partial. Cross-reference with known manufacturers of tactical equipment, specifically the XR-90 model. The lieutenant was already typing on a tablet. The bullpen was so quiet the clicking of the virtual keys sounded like gunshots. Harding stared at the drawing, his face draining of all color. He knew what an XR-90 was. It was a high-end military-grade flashlight, not something a lowlife like Ricky Finn would own. It was the kind of equipment used by professionals. By hitmen. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The lieutenant looked up from his tablet, his face grim. Captain, the partial number, XR-9077B, matches a restricted batch sold only to a private security firm called Aegis Global, a firm that has been under federal investigation for acting as muscle for the Moretti crime syndicate. A collective gasp went through the room. The Moretti syndicate. They were untouchable. They owned judges, politicians, and, it was rumored, more than a few cops. Ricky Finn wasn't their man, but the cold-eyed man in Silas's drawing with his expensive equipment and serpent tattoo, he was exactly their man. Harding hadn't just arrested the wrong person. He had arrested a convenient scapegoat to avoid poking a hornet's nest that could have ended his career in a much more violent way. He wasn't just sloppy. He was a coward. Rostova turned her gaze back to Harding. It was a look of pure, undiluted contempt. You had a witness who could identify the triggerman for the most powerful criminal organization in this city, a witness who could have dismantled their entire operation, and you were going to have him thrown in a madhouse because it was easier than doing your job. Harding's face had gone from flushed red to a ghastly, pasty white. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. A thin sheen of sweat beaded on his upper lip. He looked at Silas, at the quiet, unassuming man who had just dismantled his entire world with a cheap pen and a piece of paper. He saw no triumph in Silas's eyes, only a deep, profound pity. "Detective Harding?" Rostova's voice was the sound of a guillotine falling. "Give me your badge and your weapon." Harding stood frozen for a moment, his world collapsing in on him. Then, with trembling hands, he unclipped his badge from his belt. It fell from his numb fingers and clattered onto the floor, the sound echoing the finality of his disgrace. He unholstered his weapon and placed it on the nearest desk. He had shrunk. The man whose ego had filled the entire precinct now seemed small and frail, a hollowed-out shell. The two IA lieutenants stepped forward and, with quiet efficiency, placed him in handcuffs. His reign was over. Timestamp, Do 1, 15, Isun. The immediate aftermath was a controlled detonation. The moment the handcuffs clicked around Harding's wrists, Captain Rostova became a whirlwind of decisive action. Her voice cut through the stunned silence of the bullpen, issuing a rapid-fire series of commands that began to instantly reshape reality. Get the district attorney on the phone. Tell him I'm voiding the Finn confession on grounds of coercion and false evidence. I want Ricky Finn released from custody and placed in protective witness care within the hour, she snapped at one lieutenant. To another, she commanded, issue a citywide bolo and an arrest warrant for the subject in this drawing. Use these images. Distribute them to every precinct and every patrol car. This man is to be considered armed and extremely dangerous. I want the full resources of the department focused on this manhunt, effective immediately." The precinct, which had been frozen in shock, exploded into frantic, purposeful activity. Phones began to ring. Officers scrambled to their stations, their faces a mixture of awe and grim determination. The false victory of Harding's arrest had been replaced by the cold, hard clarity of a real hunt. The air, once thick with smug satisfaction, now crackled with the electric tension of genuine police work. Rostova then walked over to the now cuffed Harding, who was being held by the arm by one of her officers. He looked utterly broken, his expensive suit rumpled, his face slack with disbelief. "You will be transported to the federal courthouse," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "You will be charged with obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and conspiracy. The FBI will be very interested to learn why a decorated detective was so eager to protect a Moretti Syndicate hitman." Harding finally looked up, his eyes pleading. "Rostova. Ava." It wasn't like that. The pressure. The chief wanted a quick close. "Save it for your grand jury testimony," she said, turning her back on him without another word. The dismissal was absolute. He was no longer a colleague or a peer. He was just another criminal being processed. As the lieutenants led him away, a path cleared through the bullpen, officers turning away as if they couldn't bear to look at his disgrace. Amid the organized chaos, Dr. Thorne had created a small pocket of calm around Silas. He gently guided the silent man back towards the elevators, shielding him from the curious and pitying stares. Officer Miller, his own future still uncertain, fell into step beside them, acting as a self-appointed honor guard. "Captain," Miller said as Rostova approached them, "what will happen to him now?" He nodded toward Silas. Rostova's hard expression softened as she looked at Silas. She saw not a piece of evidence or a strange anomaly, but a man who had endured an incredible injustice with quiet strength. "Mr. Blackwood will be treated as the invaluable witness he is," she said, her voice firm with conviction. "He will be given a secure detail, and his testimony, his drawings, will be the centerpiece of the case against Aegis Global and the Moretti family." She then turned her full attention to Miller. The young officer braced himself. "Officer Miller," she began, and Miller's stomach plummeted. "Your actions today were a flagrant violation of the chain of command. You disobeyed a direct order, tampered with a witness in custody, and went outside the department. By the book, I should have your badge." Miller's face fell. He nodded, accepting his fate. "I understand, Captain." "However," Rostova continued, a ghost of a smile touching her lips for the first time, "the book was written by men who couldn't conceive of a situation like this. You demonstrated integrity, moral courage, and a quality of perception that is sorely lacking in this department. You saw a human being where a superior officer saw an inconvenience. You listened to silence when everyone else was deafened by noise." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I'm not taking your badge, Miller. I'm giving you a promotion. You're a detective, effective immediately. Your first assignment will be as lead liaison for Mr. Blackwood. You will ensure his safety and see that he has everything he needs." Miller was speechless. He stared at the captain, his mind struggling to process the sudden, dizzying reversal of fortune. Detective. The word felt foreign, impossible. He had started the day as a rookie patrolman facing disgrace and was ending it as a detective on the most important case in the city. Before he could formulate a response, Silas, who had been watching the exchange with his unnervingly perceptive eyes, stepped forward. He reached into the pocket of his worn trousers and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, another page from the notepad Miller had given him. He had evidently been working on it before they had arrived. He held it out not to Rostova or Thorne, but to the defeated figure of Miles Harding, who was being led towards the exit. One of the lieutenants paused, allowing Harding to see the offered paper. Hesitantly, Harding took it. He unfolded the small sheet. It was not a drawing of the crime, nor of the killer. It was a simple, elegant sketch of a ship's compass, the kind used for navigating the open sea. But the needle was not pointing north. It was broken in half, spinning uselessly within its housing. Harding stared at the image, and a single choked sob escaped his lips. It was a devastatingly precise and quiet judgment. Not a condemnation filled with anger, but a sad, simple statement of fact. You have lost your way. There was no triumph in Silas's gesture, no gloating. There was only a profound and tragic grace. It was the final, crushing blow, delivered not with a hammer, but with the gentle touch of a feather. Harding crumpled, the drawing clutched in his hand, and allowed himself to be led away into the ruin of his life. Timestamp 1:30. The epilogue of Detective Harding's career was written not in headlines, but in the cold, sterile language of legal filings and internal affairs reports. His fall was as swift as it was absolute. Faced with the irrefutable evidence of Silas's drawings and the unwavering testimony of a now-protected Ricky Finn, Harding's defenses crumbled. The federal investigation, spearheaded by a joint task force that Captain Rostova personally oversaw, uncovered a pattern of corruption and cowardice that was staggering. Harding hadn't just avoided the Moretti case, he had actively buried evidence in at least 3 other major investigations that pointed towards connected individuals, choosing instead to pin the crimes on low-level offenders who lacked the resources to fight back. His pursuit of a high conviction rate was not about justice. It was about building a personal brand, a throne of lies built on the ruins of other people's lives. He was offered a plea deal. Cooperate fully against the Moretti syndicate in exchange for a reduced sentence. His ego, though shattered, was still present enough to make him refuse, believing he could somehow outwit the federal prosecutors. It was a fatal miscalculation. The jury, presented with Silas's drawings projected onto a large screen, a silent, damning testimony that held them spellbound, took less than an hour to convict him on all counts. The judge, a man known for his harsh sentences for corrupt officials, made an example of him. Miles Harding, the golden boy of the department, was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of parole. He lost his career, his pension, his reputation, and his freedom. The newspapers that had once sung his praises now printed his haggard, defeated mugshot, a permanent monument to his hubris. The ripple effects of the silent witness case, as it came to be known, spread far beyond Harding. The real killer, identified from Silas's drawing as a former Special Forces operative named Anton Kovac, was apprehended after a dramatic 2-day manhunt, tracked down to a private airfield as he attempted to flee the country. Kovac's capture and subsequent cooperation, facilitated by the leverage the FBI now had, led to a cascade of arrests that reached the highest echelons of the Moretti crime family. The Aegis global security firm was dismantled, its assets seized. For the first time in a generation, the city's most feared criminal organization was broken, but the most profound changes happened within the police department itself. Captain Rostova, her authority now unquestionable, used the Harding case as a powerful catalyst for systemic reform. She established a new mandatory training program for all officers, focused on recognizing and interacting with neurodivergent individuals and vulnerable witnesses. It was officially designated the Blackwood Protocol. The protocol emphasized observation over assumption and patience over pressure. It fundamentally shifted the department's culture away from a singular focus on confessions and towards a more holistic, evidence-based approach. Detective David Miller, true to Rostova's word, was placed at the head of the team responsible for implementing the new protocol. He excelled in the role, his innate empathy and meticulous nature making him the perfect advocate for the new system. He became a respected figure in the department, a symbol of a new kind of policing. He never lost the sense of awe and responsibility he felt on the day he handed Silas a notepad. It became the moral compass that guided his every decision, a constant reminder that the most important truths are often the quietest. Silas, for his part, was shielded from the media circus that followed. Dr. Thorne and Captain Rostova ensured his privacy was sacrosanct. He gave his testimony through his art, creating a series of drawings for the grand jury that were so precise and detailed they were entered into the court record as forensic exhibits. Once the legal proceedings were over, he retreated from the public eye. Doctor. Thorne helped him set up a private, sunlit studio in a quiet, secluded building upstate. For the first time in his life, Silas had a safe harbor. He continued to draw, but his work changed. The frantic, desperate need to expel the horrors of the past was slowly replaced by a sense of peace. He still drew with the same impossible precision, but now he rendered landscapes of breathtaking beauty, portraits of the quiet people in the small town where he lived, capturing the dignity and grace in their ordinary lives. His art, once a scream trapped in his throat, was becoming a song. Occasionally Detective Miller or Captain Rostova would visit, bringing a cold case file with them. They would sit with him in silence, and he would study the old photographs and reports. Sometimes he would simply shake his head, but other times he would pick up a charcoal pencil and begin to draw, pulling a forgotten truth from the depths of the past and bringing it into the light. 2 years after his conviction, a man arrived at the small community arts center where Silas sometimes displayed his landscape work. He was thinner, grayer, his expensive suits replaced by ill-fitting civilian clothes. The arrogance was gone from his eyes, replaced by a hollowed-out look of deep, abiding shame. It was Miles Harding, released early for good behavior and his eventual, belated cooperation. He had sought Silas out, a pilgrimage of atonement. He found Silas standing before a large canvas, sketching the intricate pattern of veins on a fallen autumn leaf. Harding stood at a respectful distance, waiting. He didn't speak for a long time. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Harding finally said, his voice raspy and unused. "There's no forgiveness for what I did. To you, to that man, Finn, to the badge I wore, I had to come here. To tell you, that drawing you gave me, the compass." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I still have it. I look at it every day. It's the truest thing anyone has ever said to me." Silas did not turn around. He did not stop his work. He simply listened, his hand moving with quiet purpose on the canvas. "I'm trying to fix it," Harding continued, his voice barely a whisper. "The needle. I'm working at a youth center now, trying to help kids who are lost. It's not enough. It'll never be enough to balance the scales. But I had to. I had to do something." He stood in silence for another minute, a man confessing to an empty room. "Thank you," he said finally, though he wasn't sure what he was thanking him for. For telling the truth? For saving him from himself, in a way? He turned to leave, expecting no response. But then Silas's hand stopped moving. He set down his pencil, turned from the canvas, and looked directly at Harding. For the first time, there was no pity in his eyes, no sorrow. There was only a clear, calm, and neutral assessment. He picked up a small, clean sheet of paper from a nearby table. With a few swift, impossibly deft strokes, he drew a new image. He walked over and handed it to Harding. Harding took the paper with a trembling hand. It was a drawing of a single, tiny sapling, its fragile green leaves unfurling as it grew from a deep crack in a slab of broken concrete. It was not a drawing of forgiveness. It was not an absolution. It was something more difficult and more profound. It was the acknowledgement of a beginning, a testament to the fact that even in the most broken of foundations, something new could struggle and grow towards the light. Harding clutched the drawing to his chest, the tears he had held back for 2 years finally falling, and in the quiet of the art studio, surrounded by silent truths, a broken man began to piece himself back together.